So let's implement the switch button now. And for that, at the bottom of the form, below the submit button, and actually outside of the form, I'll add a new button with the inverse style, which I find to look quite nice, where I will say switch to sign up. And upon a click here, I want to execute a switch mode handler function, let's say. The name is up to you. We have to add that function to our functional component now. So here I'll add this new switch mode handler function. And the idea there is, of course, that we do just what the name implies. We switch our mode of that form. To switch a mode, we need to manage a mode. And that has to be a state, because when we change it, our component has to be re-rendered, or at least parts of it will need to be updated, and React will figure out which parts that are. So let's import useState from React to manage some state. And then here I'll set it up. Use state, and I'll name this state is login and set is login, because we either are in login mode or not. And initially, let's say we are in login mode. So initially, this is true. You can also name it is login mode and set is login mode to be even clearer about what we're managing here. So now in switch mode handler, I wanna, switch that mode. So we'll set is login mode to what it was not. So I will invert it. For that, I'll use the function form here and get my priv mode and set the new mode to not priv mode. This is this function form of updating the state, which we should use if our new state update is based on the previous state, and it basically inverts it by adding this exclamation mark. So if it was true, it's now false, and the other way around. Now we can use this login mode, this is login mode constant now, which will change. For example, here on the button, it shouldn't always say login. Instead, I want to check if we are in login mode, in which case I say login. Otherwise, I say sign up. Also here, I want to switch to, that depends. If I'm in login mode, I want to switch to sign up. If I'm in sign up mode, which is the opposite of login mode, I want to switch to login. So we want to output some text dynamically here. In addition, I also want to render a brand new input if we are in sign up mode, because then I also need to fetch the username. So here, if we're not in login mode, which is the sign up mode therefore, I will render a brand new input here in this place. The element is an input, the ID is name, the type is text, and the label is name, or your name, whatever you prefer. And validators here, here I will just require this. So we'll actually import a new validator, validator require, and use that down there in my validators array for the name. So here I'll just execute validator require. The error text here can simply be, please enter a name. And on change, of course, points at my good old input handler. Now if we save this, we see this button, and if I click it, I get an error. And we get an error because on input is not a function, because it's on input here and not on change. So now this works and we can switch between these two modes. But what you'll notice is that our form will not work correctly. If I enter an email and a password, it's not valid here, and also not in login mode. So basically, my button never unlocks here. And that makes sense, because what we just did is we added a new input, which sometimes exists and sometimes it does not. And when we switch to sign up mode, in the end, this becomes part of the form. So if I reload, for example, in login mode, I can enable the button. But now it's also enabled if I switch to sign up. So basically, we're not correctly considering this new field here. The validation inside the input works, but the form validation is not wired up correctly when we switch the mode. So we have to make sure we do that. To make sure we do that, we have to go back to the switch mode handler. And there, in the end, we want to set our form data. Now, not to reflect some initial state in our inputs down there. Those will initially always be empty. But to correctly update our behind-the-scenes form data when we switch the mode. And keep in mind that in our hook, when set data is dispatched, which happens when we call set form data, we do set the input and the form validity data. So we do update the form data whenever we call set form data, which makes sense if you have a look at the name of that function. So we want to call that whenever we switch the mode to bring it up to date with the available inputs. So here I'll check if we're not in isLogin mode, let's say, so if we are signing up, in which case I want to call set form data. Now set form data is not available right now. We need to extract it from use form as a third element here. Then we can call set form data here. Now here in set form data, I want to set my form data for the case that we're not in login mode. Now keep in mind, this here runs before we switch the mode. So if we're not in login mode, we are in sign up mode, but since switch mode handler executes and we're in that handler, it means we're now switching to login mode. So to update our form state correctly, we need to drop the name field because we're coming from sign up mode and we're going back to login mode. So the form validity depends on the validity of the email and the password field. So here I'll check form state inputs email is valid and form state inputs password is valid. If both are valid, the future form will be valid because we're switching to login mode and there we only have these two fields. Now here for the inputs, I simply want to retain the values I have for email and password and drop the value that was stored for name. So we can simply set name to undefined here, for example, to drop it. Now else, in the else branch, where we are in login mode, but we are executing switch mode handler, so we are moving to sign up mode. In this scenario here, we want to call set form data, and the form will definitely be false. The validity of the form will definitely be false because we just added the name input field and therefore it can't be valid. Now I want to retain my current form state inputs data here, so my current values for email and password, but I want to add a new name field now. And for the name field, the value initially will be empty and is valid therefore will be false, which is the reason why the overall form validity will be false. And with that we call set form data and then also set isLogin mode to switch the mode visually, and hence our UI and the behind the scenes form should be updated correctly. Now one important note, in the end of course we are performing multiple state changes here. Set form data will in the end change some state and re-render the component, and set isLogin mode will do the same. React is smart. If you have multiple state changes in the same synchronous code block, so in the same function which executes synchronously, so all the steps execute immediately after each other, it will batch them together and perform one single state update and one single re-render cycle to avoid unnecessary re-render cycles. With that, if we now save this, let's see this. Let's enter something here, some valid email address and a valid password, and switch to sign up. You see now this button is disabled, which makes sense because we added the name which is empty. If I go back to login, it's enabled again, unless I have something invalid here, which is when it crashes. So that is something we'll need to tweak. Let's see what's going wrong here. Cannot read property is valid of undefined in our form hook. And yeah, that makes sense because here, when we switched from sign up mode back to login, I set name to undefined to drop it. Now that's nice, but of course I also have to copy my existing fields, otherwise I also lose them. So we need to copy all the fields and then just overwrite name to be undefined. Now even with that change applied though, if we go back and I switch to sign up, enter nothing here, and go back to login, you'll see this still crashes with a similar error. And the reason for that is related. Now I do keep all my old inputs now, that's great, but I still set name to undefined. So the property is technically still part of the form object, the value of it just is undefined. But since it still is part in the form hook, in the input change case, when I go through all my inputs, I still of course find this name input as an input, the value just is undefined, but the property is still there, and therefore I still try to access is valid on the property. There are various solutions for that. One solution is that we add one extra if clause here in the for loop, and we check if state inputs for the given input ID, if that is truthy, or to be precise, by adding an exclamation mark here, if it is falsy. Which means, is it undefined? If it is undefined, then I continue here. Now, what does continue do? Continue basically tells JavaScript that we don't continue with this iteration of the for loop, and instead we go to the next iteration, so to the next property in this case. So we skip this property if it is undefined, because then I don't need to validate it, and I don't want to adjust my form validity. And if we now save this and we go back, I can switch to Signup and switch back here. And if I now enter something here, you see this works just fine. And if I now go here, enter max, that's looking good. Remove the password here, it's invalid, switch back, enter it back. So that is looking good. This looks now like it works. And that fixes the issue of us switching modes and changing the form therefore. Now if we click submit here, we see email name and password being submitted with the data we entered. If I go back to login and I click login, we see name is undefined, which is fine, but email and password is there. So this seems to work, and this is how we could implement this with different modes between which we switch and different form data which we manage for those modes behind the scenes.